Obviously, the big piece of news and the big talking point here is that the Sabres did move on from Casey Mittelstadt, as we discussed on our trade deadline preview show, as what the type of compensation that they would need to get. And Casey Mittelstadt being their best asset, as you mentioned on last week's show, they end up being able to move him, and they got a significant piece back in Bowen Byram, a defenseman that was a former 4th overall pick in this league.
Yeah, I mean, I think I ended the last episode by saying I don't expect him to get traded. So naturally, he got traded. That is the type of trade that Adam said he was looking for if it was going to be a significant move for Mittelstadt, and it's a top 4 defenseman. Nice hockey trade, talent for talent swap. When the trade first was originally announced, I was excited. I like Bowen Byram. He's a very good player. I did think it was a little bit redundant given the style of defender that he is, and that Buffalo has, 2 of those style players in their top 4. But the more I thought about it, it's clear this is how Kevin Adams wants to construct his blue line. He went out. He says he wasn't shopping Mittelstadt, but clearly, when you have those conversations, it's not like, sure, you're not actively shopping it, but this type of player that you're looking for. So clearly, Byram was someone that he identified. And I think you saw it in his first 2 games. He's a really good fit. There's, a little bit of risk in that. Mittelstadt has been playing really well for Buffalo. He was their leading scorer. Byram was having, I guess, quote unquote, a little bit of a down year in terms of his production and things like that. But, he's come in. Maybe injuries were part of it, but he's come in. He's been on the penalty kill, the number 1 power play unit. He's playing on the top pair with Rasmus Dahlin, which it seems like that's where they wanted him to play the second they acquired him, right? That's the trade Adam said he was going to make. He made it. I don't really understand. I can see why maybe some people were a little bit upset if they really wanted to keep Mittelstadt, but my whole thing and thinking was the whole time is people who wanted to change on this team, the only way to get that change was to move Mittelstadt, and now you see that. We have the top 4 defensemen that they were lacking, and now there's an opening for a key contributing forward. Whether that's Peyton Krebs stepping up or whether Kevin Adams goes out and gets that forward is what remains to be seen.
And as you mentioned, he was really the only significant player that they could move or, had the ability to move with his contract situation, obviously being an RFA this upcoming summer, and would I guess in his age range, there's a lot of players that they have locked up to long-term deals in that sense. And we mentioned that Buffalo's prospect pool is obviously very good as well. And they've got some guys in Rochester that we mentioned, and even in junior that are chomping at the bit to get up here on this team. So you're going to need to make room for some of those guys as well. If Adams doesn't want to move on from prospects, something had to give here. And although you're without Jack Quinn for the rest of the year, you're going to insert him back in there as well. Although Mittelstadt has moved up and down the lineup, been a versatile guy, as you mentioned, led the team in points no matter where he was slotted in the lineup. So it is going to be a hole and a void that they're going to have to address and fill. But if you're technically not looking at the rest of this year, even though they're still kind of in it at this point, I think it's a long-term move they had to make. And if a guy like Bowen Byram was available, because we know how highly touted defensemen are in this league, especially ones that are drafted so high like Byram was, and he's still only 22 years old, and they've locked up this very young decor for a long period of time. So you have to give up stuff you have to give up something to get something, and I think that's exactly what happened for both teams in this trade. I think it's a great trade for the Colorado Avalanche as well, getting Mittelstadt to come in there and really solidify that second line center that they've lost since losing Nazem Kadri, and Ryan Johansson didn't work out there. So I think this is one of those hockey trades that I think, as you mentioned before, is something that's going to work out for both sides. And Sabres got a top 4D, which they wanted. Maybe not exactly the right shot that they wanted, but he fills that top 4 void if you don't really know where Yoki Haru is going to sit on this. But I think it was a great trade for both sides, and it was probably the most significant trade of the whole trade deadline week, other than Jake Gensel going for a couple of minor prospects. But to me, that was a really solid hockey trade on both ends.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really nice hockey trade. It's the type of trade that you don't necessarily see all the time come trade deadline. It's the
Buyer
talent
sellers.
for talents. Yeah, it's the talent for talent swap. Like I said, I think the unfortunate thing is, like you said, mentioning Jack Quinn being out. I think Jack Quinn being out really does stink, because then at least you could see what the top 9 would look like with Krebs subbed in for Mittelstadt, because the top 9 would be healthy. Unfortunately, the Sabres don't get to see that, but that's not an excuse for the team's performance. It's more an excuse for, I wish we could see that just to get a proper evaluation of what this top 9 that they have in-house kind of looks like here. That's beside the point, but yeah, it's like I said, Adams was pretty transparent that if the right trade was there, talent for talent, now for now, he was going to make the swap, and he did. I will give Adams credit for that. He does seem to stick to his guns and at least do what he says, whether it's exactly how you want it or not. You know, the year that they signed Comrie and Lyubushkin, he's like, we're going to get a goalie, we're going to get a rugged defensive defenseman. They did. Now, did those work out? No. Last offseason, he said he's going to shore up the defense. He signed Clifton and Eric Johnson. Did it work out? Not necessarily. But he's kind of stuck to his guns, which I guess he deserves some credit for that. But now it's on him. He did say, you know, at his trade deadline press conference, he tried to add a veteran center and it didn't happen. And I kind of said, I was like, that's good. I'm glad he did identify that as a need. But the second you admit that you tried to get it and it didn't happen, that means there's no excuse to not get it done in the offseason. So, like I said, he opened up that spot in their forward group. It's now on him to go out and get it, or hope that over these next, you know, the rest of the seasons, Peyton Krebs really shows what he can do. I do think that Krebs is a third line center. I think he can flourish in that role. I know, you know, people don't necessarily agree. I think most people are happy to see him, hopefully that he gets another chance. I know on paper he's on the third line. Granado's not really playing him as a third line center. He's still playing a very minimal amount, but that's beside the point. So it's evaluation time for that role. But as we're going to talk about later in the show, like, it's not really evaluation point for the season, because somehow, some way, this season could be very, very interesting if the results go the Sabres' way this week.
And as you mentioned, like, with that hole with Mittelstadt there, and you mentioned Krebs wanting to take a bigger step there, and we've seen flashes that he could if Granato gave him the adequate playing time, and like you mentioned, that's another discussion for another day. But when you have a hole like that in the forward group, obviously the defense looks a lot better. Like, do you see how how it makes them better for the short term? I know it's more of a long-term play. It makes them better on the back end, but if you're trying to really make a playoff push, as they're trying to say that they're still doing at the moment, when you take out a guy like Casey Mittelstadt and you don't bring in another forward, you lose Kyle Opozo as well, which we'll get into. Like, your forward group got worse, so unless there was a shining star in Rochester that you were going to come up and you knew that was going to make an impact right away, why wouldn't they at least try to go out and get a veteran guy to kind of fill that spot for the rest of the year, even if it was a rental where they gave up a late round pick or something like that? Or I know Adams also said that there were some options about bringing in veterans, but then you move out Opozo, so what was the sense in that? And didn't want to kind of ruin the team dynamic and the leadership, I guess, structure within that room. So I don't even know where he wanted to go with that.
Yeah, so I'll answer your question in two different parts. I think, one, how do they get better now? Well, you get better now by your defense is now very stacked. You can now play your top four, even top six, really, because like Jacob Bryson is playing really well in his minutes that he's playing. Clifton is a little bit still inconsistent, but I think he's a lot better than he was earlier in the year. Yoki Haru is still playing well. You now have taken a lot of the load off Dahlin and Power's shoulders, giving them another guy to run with in the top four. With that run where Dahlin was playing 29 plus minutes doesn't need to happen anymore, because you can throw Byram out there on the power play, which we've seen him and Dahlin together. You can throw Byram out there on the penalty kill, which we have seen so far. The other part is, yeah, Adams did make the forward group weaker, but I will say he did mention that he wanted to acquire a veteran center. It just didn't happen. So at least he recognizes that it happened. I think short term, you're better because now, and we've seen it, your offense is going to start to become from your defense, and then in hopes that throughout the rest of the year, your big guys start scoring somewhat close to what we've expected to. We've seen Bryson, Byram, Dahlin, Power. Those guys have been scoring and driving offense the last little while. Tage finally got on the board with a power play goal. If those big guys continue to, they're not going to get back to the level that they were at last year. I just don't think that's possible. I think there's some health things that are going on that we don't necessarily know about. But if they can kind of get back to a somewhat respectable level with the defense still producing, in their minds, that will make the team better in the short term. And then you still have Luukkonen, who's playing extremely well. So I think that is their plan for the short term. Long term, let's see what Krebs can do in this third line role. If he's the real guy, that's good. If not, we know we have to go out and still acquire that veteran center. So I think I don't mind the long term and short term, outlooks there. But yeah, there was no doubt trading Mittelstadt was going to make your forward group weaker. I mean, unfortunately, Byram's debut, that Nashville game, the second Tage was out of that game, everyone kind of knew, okay, this is going to be a disaster, because this team is not built to be without their top center and Mittelstadt, who is their third line center. So at least when Krebs is in the lineup, they can go Tage, Cousins, Krebs is their top three. When Tage isn't an option, you're kind of screwed.